Este es un contenido de Uninorte Académico. Suscríbete, aprende y comparte.
Welcome back. We hope this first day of Congress has been stimulating and that you feel energized at this time of the day. And we're closing with a very interesting talk by Dr. James Corcoran, whom I have the pleasure to introduce. Dr. James Corcoran is Associate Professor at the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at York University in Canada. He holds a PhD in Language and Literacy Education from the University of Toronto. His research interests include language teacher education, linguistics, academic writing, language teacher education, critical English for specific or academic purposes, qualitative and mixed methods research. His most recent project is titled Scholarly Writing for Publication at a Bilingual College. In this project, he uses mixed methods to investigate the research writing landscape at a bilingual Canadian college, highlighting the collective and individual practices of plurilingual faculty. So let's welcome Professor Corcoran with a big applause. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Bueno, bienvenidos a todos y todas. Soy James Corcoran, profesor de la Universidad de York en Canadá. Y me gustaría comenzar dando las gracias al comité organizador, principalmente Jesús. I'm so happy to be here with you all today in person for my first ALES conference. Hoje tentarei defender a ética subjacente a uma orientação mais crítica e plurilingüe para o ensino e a pesquisa de LRPP nas Américas, concluindo a minha palestra com questões para reflexão para todos vocês que estão presentes hoje. Bom, vamos lá. Okay, just to make sure that you're energized and engaged, I thought we would start with an activity. Yeah. So, with the person beside you and being extremely concise, I would like you to discuss and answer the following questions. So, in which languages do you write when attempting to publish your work? How do you decide to write in one or more languages? And how have these practices changed over time? So again, let's give about 2 minutes to each person. Do this in pairs. I'll use my teacher. Come together in pairs. And go. Okay, time. I hope you continue this discussion, but that's just making sure you're ligado. And this is the focus today on these types of questions. Bom, aquí hay algunos términos que utilizaré durante esta presentación y que merecen una explicación. So, knowledge production, like the diffusion of academic knowledge, most often via research articles, but understood more broadly to include books, book chapters, conference presentations, proceedings, etc. ERPP, so English for research publication purposes, a sort of subfield of English, I guess a subfield of applied linguistics, part of English for academic purposes. Maybe it's a sort of growing field that may be a field, maybe not. But I like to call it language or languages for research publication purposes, sort of decentering English. Bon, another slightly problematic term, plurilingual. I use this plurilingual EAL, scholars who use English as an additional language for publication purposes. Problematic because I'm plurilingual, but I don't use English as an additional language. So anyway, what I'll be talking about today, critical plurilingualism, an orientation to research and pedagogy that draws upon critical applied linguistics and plurilingual theory of language. And I'll go deeper into those things. Emerging and established scholars, pretty straightforward. So, subjectivity is important here. So who am I? I am a very white or pink, maybe, cis male descendant of colonial settlers on indigenous lands in what is now known as Canada. I'm also a plurilingual scholar and global citizen who's always felt kinship to Latin America, where much of my teaching and research has taken place. Despite this affinity, I am occupying the traditional role of native English speaker plenarist at this event, where all too often someone from the Anglosphere comes to share their knowledge with those in the South, bringing light to the darkness. This is an uncomfortable position to be in for someone who constantly argues for more equitable relations of power in academia. However, perhaps it can be somewhat mitigated by my symbolic translanguaging during this presentation, though I recognize this translanguaging includes only colonial languages. Next, though my main research interests are the political economy of English for academic purposes in Canada and the politics and practices surrounding knowledge production in the Americas, and by the way, I use these scare quotes because it's a contested term, I'm first and foremost a teacher. In fact, all of my research must have implications for my and others' teaching practice. More about that later. Here you can find links to all my work, and by the way, I'll share all of these slides, so no need to take pictures of the slides during the presentation. Por lo tanto, siempre me ha interesado la política de la enseñanza y el aprendizaje de idiomas, desde que empecé a dar clases en Brasil hace más de 20 años. Esto me llevó a cursar un máster en el que intenté comprender mejor la división material y ideológica entre los profesores del inglés nativos y no nativos en Brasil. A partir de ahí, desarrollé un gran interés por la escritura para la publicación por parte de aquellos que utilizan el inglés como lengua adicional, indagando de nuevo en los retos que esto supone en un mercado de producción de conocimiento en el que el inglés y a menudo sus hablantes nativos se eleva a expensas de otras lenguas. Realicé mi investigación doctoral en México y desde entonces me ha dedicado a la investigación y la enseñanza relacionadas con la LRPP en México, Brasil y Canadá. Para comprender mejor mi trabajo y mi argumento de hoy, debemos considerar algunos aspectos del panorama global de la producción de conocimiento. A continuación, se presentan algunas tendencias destacadas en la producción mundial de conocimiento, que también se aplican a América Latina. Sin embargo, antes de pintar al inglés como el gran y malvado hegemónico que lo es, veamos con mayor claridad la producción de conocimiento en América Latina. So, English, most certainly still hyper-dominant. The term publish in English or perish still applies for the most part globally. This field of ERPP has highlighted that with bibliometric work, more recently, more qualitative work that has sort of provided, there's quantitative proof and qualitative proof extensive of the additional burden of writing in an additional language experienced by scholars across geolinguistic contexts. Also, this field has shown the complex range of factors that influence language choice, including disciplinary affiliation, national and institutional policies and reward systems, whether it be the National Science Council or internal university reward systems, scholarly identities, and language proficiency. There's a growing body of work looking at writing practices and how they're impacted by emerging technologies, networked activity, individual subjectivities, etc. And perhaps there's a shift toward a more democratic, and when I use that word, I'm drawing on Natalia Avila's work. And when I say democratic, more multilingual, more accessible exchange of knowledge. So I thought here I'd highlight two pieces that you haven't seen because they're not published yet, but they're almost published. So, for example, and this is to prove that English is not the hegemonic language, the only language of knowledge production, but for example, this bibliometric work shows that in the past 35 years, Indonesian, Portuguese, and Spanish have expanded at a faster pace than English. And country-level analyses show that this trend is due to the growing strength of the Latin American and Indonesian academic circuits. So this is clearly the result of particular policies, but more on that later. And what those policies are those that recognize the value of both national language and English language publications. Another study here, this one only on Latin America, again, showing the sort of distribution between English, Spanish, and Portuguese across a range of disciplines. And again, it's clear that this is a plurilingual landscape of knowledge production. Okay, here goes again. En primer lugar, el campo que investiga estas tendencias que existe desde hace unos 30 años se domina inglés para la publicación, o como me gusta llamarlo, lenguaje para la publicación, LRPP. Se enumeran algunas tendencias en este campo que yo situaría en la intersección entre la educación, la lingüística aplicada y los estudios sobre la escritura, entre las que se incluyen el cambio de un trabajo más bibliográfico a uno cualitativo, el reconocimiento de la complejidad de la elección del lenguaje, una comprensión más amplia de lo que entendemos por escritura, etc. Por cierto, me ha resistido a insertar citas en las diapositivas y en su lugar he incluido varios diapositivos con referencias de interés al final de este PowerPoint. Okay, so what? Bueno, adoptando una orientación sociolingüística como escritores, instructores, designers de currículos, formuladores de políticas, etc., defendo que devemos estar atentos às realidades potenciais, desafios e tensões associados à produção de conhecimento plurilingüe nas Américas. Isso é particularmente importante, eu diria, para professores, mas também para aqueles que pesquisam a escrita acadêmica. Nos slides a seguir, vou delinear os pilares ontoepistemológicos do plurilinguismo crítico, uma abordagem ou orientação para o ensino e investigação da escrita acadêmica. Okay, so what is this thing? Critical plurilingualism, and what are its foundational pillars? So first, we have to wrap our heads around plurilingualism and how it differs from other isms that theorize languages, as a range of semiotic resources we draw upon to achieve particular communicative goals. Now, what I'm not going to do is sit here and tell you that you must use the term plurilingual, as opposed, for example, to translingual, to describe, or translanguaging, to describe the semiotic acts with respect to knowledge production. I do argue, however, that it's well-suited, plurilingualism that is, when adopted more critically, to describe scholars who balance languages within their repertoires when writing for publication. Working with these notes was much smoother when I practiced earlier. So, to borrow a term from my colleague Steve Marshall, there's a panoply of isms that each have their own history, epistemology, and sometimes, but not always, ontology. Over the past decades, the field of applied linguistics has undergone a shift where theorists and practitioners alike have dismissed the antiquated notion of balanced bilingualism, where languages are seen as completely autonomous, discrete systems, and where the objective is equal and full competence in both languages. More accepted now are theories of language that recognize hybridity and varying degrees of competence within and between languages. One of the theories that has emerged from enhanced sociolinguistically informed understandings of diverse, dynamic, and interrelated repertoires of languages is plurilingualism. In essence, plurilingualism can be defined broadly as a theory of language that describes sociolinguistic phenomena where people wield multiple languages. If this sounds like multilingualism or translanguaging, it is. Indeed, hybridity is central to both pluri and translingual theories of language. However, a clear area of divergence, for example, between multi and pluri, is the focus on the individual language user and their practices, agency, etc., and that's plurilingual, versus focus on larger groups of language users in broader society, multilingual. And while there are significant convergences between them, for example, they're both interested in individual agency and dynamic use of diverse linguistic repertoires, or for translingual theory, reservoirs is more accurate. A small area of divergence between pluri and trans is the historical usage of translanguaging as a descriptor of mostly K-12 language practices, specifically in the northeastern and southwestern US. So I choose plurilingual. It doesn't mean you have to, but I'll try to make an argument that taking a more critical version of plurilingual, which I could sit here for hours breaking down, critiquing, showing how problematic the term is, as it was conceived by Council of Europe. You can make your own decision, but I'll make the argument that critical plurilingualism is a reasonable, effective, and equitable approach when looking at advanced writing. Portanto, antes de me envolver em uma autocrítica de plurilinguismo, deixe-me descrever minha variedade mais crítica, como uma orientação para a pesquisa e o ensino da escrita acadêmica. Como você pode ver aqui, contexto em excesso, há reconhecimento de pluricompetência por parte dos acadêmicos, ao mesmo tempo em que se promove o que meu ex-orientador Jim gosta de chamar de relações colaborativas de poder, em vez de coercive relations of power. Mais uma vez, há texto demais, mas deixo esses slides aqui para aqueles que quiserem voltar e ler mais tarde. Portanto, elemento claro da pesquisa e da pedagogia enfatizado pelo critical plurilingualism é a validação e a reflexão crítica sobre repertórios plurilingües dinâmicos a escolher quais idiomas usar e como usá-los. Isso inclui o potencial de ensinar redação para publicação, não em inglês, mas, em nossos casos, em inglês e espanhol, ou inglês e português, ou só em espanhol, ou só em português. I've seen it done. Aumentando a acessibilidade e diminuindo a necessidade de especialistas anglófonos, embora nem todos os anglófonos sejam iguais. Por lo tanto, esta orientación de CP, o Critical Plurilingualism, cuestiona explícitamente las relaciones de poder desiguales y la hegemonía del inglés como lengua franca para el intercambio de conocimientos, tanto en la investigación como en la pedagogía, con un enfoque explícito en los repertorios plurilingües para fines de publicación de investigaciones. So it's one of my main critiques of this field of ERPP that it often takes a limited and limiting monolingual orientation towards plurilingual scholars' research writing, often focused on, taking a deficit position. Okay, what are the problems with these scholars and their English proficiency? And what's preventing them from publishing in English? Which contributes to the reification of existing unequal relations of power and the hegemony of English in knowledge exchange. So critical plurilingualism recognizes the social semiotic toolkits that people draw upon to make meaning with an explicit focus on these repertoires for research publication purposes. La versión crítica de plurilingüismo que defiendo es un desafío explícito a la lingüística aplicada normativa o convencional que con demasiada frecuencia es agnóstica en cuanto al poder. CP se basa en enfoques neomarxistas y postestructuralistas de la enseñanza de idiomas y el poder, e intenta equilibrar dos posiciones teóricas críticas pero contrapuestas. Una que pone de relieve las desigualdades sistémicas y otra que exige el reconocimiento de las subjetividades individuales y al considerar, como describe Pennycook, los efectos contingentes y contextuales del poder en relación con el acceso, la exclusión, la reproducción y la resistencia. Okay, so here we have sort of a really simple compare and contrast between normative and critical orientations. So monolingual versus plurilingual, apolitical versus explicitly political, power agnostic versus interested, identity agnostic versus interested. Taking that to the classroom, there are two columns here. So 3 curricular tiers. And this is an approach that my colleague Karen Englander and I have championed. So 1 tier, critical genre awareness, the next tier, critical language awareness, and the final, critical sustainable social practices. So what does that mean? And what's the difference between a normative approach and a more critical one? So rather than just identifying the standard features, right? The discourse community norms, the structural components, the rhetorical moves that are made, right? Rather than just identifying and copying them, it's rather historically situating them and suggesting a range of alternatives, comparing and contrasting standard and non-standard construction in research articles, analyzing and promoting diversity of expression. Then on the next tier down, right? Recognizing and validating intelligibility over accuracy, and drawing on Suresh Kanagaraj's work, focus on discursive and non-discursive features of scholarly writing for publication. So we all know what discursive features are, but non-discursive are things beyond the text, like access to library resources, like access to language support, right? Advanced literacy support, etc. And in terms of social practices, right? Instead of just identifying the steps that are taken between production and publication, it's examining and reflecting on the impact of publishing choices, right? And examining and reflecting upon agency and relations of power between all those who are involved in this process, between producing and publishing, right? So that means authors, reviewers, and editors. So again, that was the pedagogical. Now, as the research orientation, right? So drawing on MJ and Teresa's work and Federico and company's work, advocating for a mindful move from a monolingual to a plurilingual gaze when doing this research, focusing on the experiences of plurilingual scientists as they draw upon their language repertoires that naturally shift across time, space, and context, depending on their biographies, lived experiences, social trajectories, and life paths. And argue, again, for a more plurilingual orientation, promoting diversity and plurality, and reflecting upon, and this is where subjectivity comes in, and choices as researchers, how our research and pedagogical orientations maintain or challenge unequal relations of power between individuals and groups operating in the current knowledge economy. So I thought I would move from sort of explicating those underpinnings to giving examples of what this looks like for me. And then you can reflect on whether that's meaningful for you. So even though there isn't time to dive deep into the findings, I thought I would discuss a little bit of the work I've been doing recently and a project called Bilingual Outcomes, Plurilingual Repertoires, Producción de Conocimiento en una Universidad Canadiense. So skipping to the research questions. To the research. Estas son las tres preguntas principales que impulsan esta investigación. And as you can see, the research questions provide the conditions for a critical, what I would describe as a critical plurilingual investigation. So, which languages and genres do scholars use? What are their main reasons motivating them to use particular languages when they're writing for publication? And how do they draw upon their semiotic repertoires when producing and revising texts? So there's quantitative data here, qualitative data, but I'm going to skip to the discussion. So this slide highlights some of the main takeaways from this investigation, right? So the results largely echo the domestic and international literature on the importance, for example, of disciplinary affiliation in inspiring particular language choices. However, some novel findings that stand out and demand further investigation are the dynamic plurilingual nature of conference presentations, for example, as a genre of research production. Next, the ideologies of plurilingual scholars regarding the separation of languages in their repertoires was clear. Also clear the iterative, idiosyncratic nature of research production practices, very different for different scholars. And the apparent production at this institution by those without research in their professional portfolios, who we call teaching stream faculty in Canada. So we identified that about 30% of the production at this university is done by people who don't have research in their portfolio, right? They're paid to do teaching and administration. In this way, as discussed in the next slide, this institutional case appears to be a uniquely Canadian and, drawing on Karen Bennett's work, a semi-peripheral context within a center. Como sostiene Bennett, en estos espacios semi-periféricos, los individuos y las instituciones se encuentran en un espacio intermedio de impulsos contradictorios donde se enciende la resistencia y se trazan nuevos caminos. Los resultados de este estudio describen el CFC, which is the pseudonym for this bilingual institution, como un espacio semi-periférico de este tipo en el que abundan las competencias plurilingües y pluriculturales dentro de un mercado mundial de intercambio de conocimiento cada vez más homogéneo. Sin embargo, los caminos que trazan los investigadores de CFC siguen siendo una cuestión abierta. So here are some questions that emerge from this study, for example. And as you can see, the questions range from those at the level of policy to pedagogy, right? So for individuals, for example, who have French as their L1, English as L2, in an institution and in a city surrounded by English, should there be explicit policies to promote academic production in French? Next, for individuals, what are the costs and benefits, right, of promoting plurilingual knowledge production practices and this is the case for this institution, it's precariously situated, not just because it's a bilingual institution surrounded by English institutions, but because it is in danger of losing funding and perhaps collapsing entirely. What services and resources should institutions provide to better support plurilingual knowledge production in English, French, and other languages? And as large language model assistive writing becomes more and more ubiquitous among plurilingual scholars, does plurilingualism and its related onto-epistemologies reflect broader semiotic repertoires, under-researched and highlighted group, for example, Anglophones. So the participants were not only French L1, but some of them English L1 who published in other languages as well. And their hybrid processes, the dynamism of conference presentations, for example, suggest the need to reframe plurilingual as more than just those who use English as an additional language. So here's how you can find this work. And again, for myself, and I'll talk about how I operationalize this at the level of dissemination of my work. Here's a chapter that's coming out soon in French. So what does a research agenda that's critical and plurilingual look like for me? Well, it's one that focuses on phenomena beyond language proficiency, and specifically English language proficiency. It's adopting methodologies that allow for a deeper understanding of language repertoires and how they're drawn upon by scholars who eventually, and this is where bibliometric work fails to capture this, right? It's understanding, even if the product ends up in one language, what were the processes that took place in the production of that research article, for example. I'm looking to do work that has implications that provide direction for a range of stakeholders for how to enact change that challenge the hegemony of English and perhaps other colonial languages. I'm looking to forefront my subjectivity, even when not conducting ethnographic work. A focus on plurilingual scholar voice and how it may be shifting with the emergence of generative AI. A focus on less and lesser known languages, which I'll show you in a minute. And a focus on relations of power and how language mediates these relations, not just as a form of critical discourse analysis or critique, but also as a means of understanding different ways of transforming the world. So from research to pedagogy. So here's a description of a course I co-delivered to mostly PhD students, some faculty in Porto Alegre last year. As you'll notice in the coming slides, and I delivered this course with my colleague, Simone Sarmento, and it was delivered in English and Portuguese. As you'll notice in the coming slides, it was a quick and dirty version of this type of course delivered in only 3 days, because that's the funding we had. Ideally, such a course would be delivered over 2 to 3 weeks. And what does this kind of course look like? So after introducing our approach, right, sort of an overview of the global landscape, of the Brazilian landscape, of knowledge production, moving into, okay, for me, and again, this was a discipline broad audience, right? So how do I identify an appropriate journal in my area related to my research topic? Next, what are some reasons why research articles are rejected? And then a very popular element of this type of course is bringing in an editor from a journal. And again, if it's discipline specific, from that disciplinary area, when it's discipline broad, I guess any editor would do. And then having a Q&A, right, with the audience for them to better understand some challenges when trying to get their work published. Next, sort of trumpeting the benefits of becoming a discourse analyst. and doing that with them. So breaking down a research article, showing some of the structural components, highlighting some of the rhetorical moves that are made in each of the different sections of a research article. And then having students create their own corpus, right? So identifying 3 or 4 pieces connected to their very niche area that they're interested in, right? And analyzing those and comparing that to the breakdown that we did of the research article previously. All of that in one day. Ideally, it's done in a week rather than a day. So here's day 2 or week 2. So understanding publication, who are the players and what do they do? And then taking a sort of genre-based approach, again, critical genre-based approach, looking at IMRAD and disciplinary variations on this model of introduction, methods, results, and discussion, breaking down each of those sections of a research article, highlighting the different moves that are made. This is where some intercultural rhetorical approach is useful here. So comparing and contrasting, sort of what's the difference between an English language research article in your discipline and a Portuguese language one, and especially introduction and discussion sections, which are quite different, even though that is essentializing. Next, sort of some tips on how to become a better editor of your own work, followed by writing groups, trying to suggest that these students join writing groups, both to focus on process and as an accountability lever, and bringing in a guest speaker to describe what do these groups look like, what are their potential benefits, etc. How to write an abstract. So this is, again, because we were pressed for time, taking a small bit that could be produced in a couple of days. So write an abstract of your work, and then breaking down an abstract. What are the moves that are made when writing an abstract? What do effective abstracts look like? What's missing here, you'll see, is that when you do this type of course in 3 days, there's a lot of lecture and there's not a lot of writing time. And when you do it in 3 weeks, you have opportunities to engage with students' writing, for them to take time to process the information, and to get feedback on their writing. Next, day or week 3, right? Again, returning to the writing of effective abstracts. We asked students to do that for homework. 40% of them maybe did it. So for PhD students, what's one of the biggest challenges when they're graduating? Differentiating between how to write a dissertation and how to write a research article, and how to draw the research articles out of their dissertation work, right? How to divide the pizza, as it were. And then focusing on writing as a social practice, right? So getting these scholars to reflect on the languages they're using, how they see that as part of their academic or scholarly identities, and then discussing how to navigate production, submission, and revision. So for example, sustainable writing practices, giving tips on that, and then using feedback. There's the feedback from reviewer 2, right? How do you deal with negative feedback from a reviewer? And using some actual examples to help students process. Because one of the things we found, whether working with faculty or grad students, oftentimes negative feedback leads to the research being shelved. And then sometimes they never come back to it. They're just left there. Followed by focus on strategies for improving writing, accessing resources, and building networks. So again, drawing on the research in the area, Networked activity is one of the biggest markers of sustainable success, right? So how are students how are faculty creating these networks, engaging in these networks at a local, regional, and international level? And next, and increasingly more important by the day, analyzing and giving suggestions on how to effectively use these tools that are at our disposal now, right? So translation tool like DeepL and ChatGPT, for example. Yeah, so what does a critical pedagogical agenda look like for me? So interventions that take a social practices approach, that are not just focused on the product, but the process, and understanding that this doesn't just happen, it's people that are doing this. It's people who are producing the work, people who are reviewing the work, and how to navigate these situations. Interventions that recognize the dominance and importance of English, as well as challenging the state of affairs via plurilingual publication. So oftentimes, this can be a hard sell because students or faculty are there and they want it in English and they want to do English. Why? Well, because my institutional evaluation system is giving me 10 times as many points for publishing in English. So discussing, okay, how do we deal with that, right? While maintaining their agency. Okay, can you publish one thing in English and publish something else in Spanish or Portuguese that's connecting with the stakeholders that you really want to connect with, not just gaining you international status and recognition. Interventions that promote critical language awareness, so understanding the potential of language. Interventions focused on capacity building. So this is my main interest now, is not working with PhD students, it's working with faculty, it's working with experts at an institution so that the courses can be offered by those experts at that institution, shifting away from a model from the Anglosphere expert. And interventions that highlight the context-specific nature of the places in which they're delivered, with an eye to attending to the needs and desires and wants of the scholars. So again, so I talked about research, talked about pedagogy. So for me, what does a knowledge dissemination and adjudication agenda look like? So it's plurilingual, increasingly for me. Although I could probably be more productive doing things only in English, it's pushing myself to uncomfortable spaces and experiences to publish in other languages. It's translanguaging within an article rather than sticking to just one language and demanding more of readers and identifying spaces where these type of publications are welcome. And I'll show you an example of these type of publications in a second, but generally they're open access. So I've stopped writing for large publishing houses, ones that are closed access. I'll only publish now in open access journals, and again, or with a publisher that publishes books that are open and accessible, right, to the communities I'm trying to connect with. Increasingly, it's multimodal production. So trying to stretch the boundaries of what knowledge production looks like. And again, I'll show you an example of this. And it's self-reflexive, right? Engaging with subjectivity, again, even when uncomfortable. So here's an example of one such book, as I shamelessly promote a book that I co-edited. So plurilingual perspectives on scholarly writing for publication. So as you can see in the title, right? So within, a través y au-delà des frontières, nas Américas. So Spanish, Portuguese, English, all in the title. French, all in the title. And now I'll show you the table of contents. So again, this will be published any day, but not quite yet. So here's a sneak peek. So again, this is a project sort of 10 years that I've been imagining, and it's finally come to pass. So as you can see, there are English language chapters, there are French language chapters, there are Indigenous and Creole languages chapters, Portuguese chapters, Spanish chapters. So, it starts with a Spanish chapter, then a chapter where we're all over the place, translanguaging like crazy in the chapter. Moving on to section 1, scholarly writing for publication on language, power, and policies, right? With a chapter in Spanish, followed by Portuguese, followed by Spanish. Oops. Followed by one in English, followed by one in Guadeloupean Creole and English, followed by one in English and Cree, an Indigenous language, the largest Indigenous language in Canada, Central Canada at least. Section 3, perspectives and practices in publishing. So starting with a Portuguese chapter, then French, Portuguese, French. The 4th section, which it would be an entire book on this topic, would be interesting, but I thought I would highlight one chapter. Okay. You can't see it very well, but you'll have to believe me that Diana Wygant's chapter here, where she switches between English, French, and Spanish, where she's reflecting on her sort of lifelong journey of writing and writing for publication. And there are multiple chapters like that. In the Coda by my colleague Ian Martin, again, talking about the place of Indigenous languages and a call for linguistic, epistemic, and ontic plurality. Oops. Think I have enough slides? Sorry if it's making you dizzy. So now we come to sort of tensions, challenges, and considerations in decolonial times. So I put a Southern turn as a question mark here. So what is critical in a post-truth era? How can we operationalize critical approaches to our work? What does it look like in this field? I hope I'm making a good argument for it, but as more critical approaches hopefully become more mainstream, what is critical is up for debate. The plurilingual scholar paradox. So by offering these courses, which are enhancing English for publication purposes capacities, am I just helping to reify these unequal relations of power? Because what's been noted in the research is when plurilingual scholars start publishing more in English, it tends to start to dominate their production practices and sometimes becomes their only language of publication for many of the reasons we discussed earlier. Plurilingualism is problematic in that it bounds languages. It creates sort of these artificial boundaries between, for example, English and Portuguese and Spanish, rather than understanding how we're drawing on these resources, right, as part of our reservoirs of languages. And that's why I could potentially be convinced that translingual theory is probably more accurate to describe those processes, how that's happening. Nevertheless, I argue that plurilingual is good because we're generally talking about products, academic knowledge that is in a particular language. Balancing structural reform with recognition of individual subjectivities, right? So how do we take, how do we act on the implications of our work, recognizing agency of individuals, even if they want to publish all of their work in English, right? So how do we affirm that while also sort of recognizing that structural reform can't happen without diversifying that linguistic landscape. Also problematic, and attention, educational reforms and interventions are not a panacea for all our social ills, as much as we like to think so, right? So I can sit here and say, critical plurilingualism is the way to go. It's gonna change these unequal relations of power. Well, maybe in a small way, but it needs to be part of larger social projects, right, that are pushing in the same direction. And increasingly, you know, what is or should be the role of indigenous languages in this sort of ecology of languages and genres? It's an open question. So here are some questions I continue to ask myself as I'm moving forward, and maybe you want to ask yourself the same thing. So how am I promoting diversity of expression in my academic practice, in my teaching? For those of you who are reviewers and editors at journals, in your gatekeeping practices, and for me in my research production practices. What's my responsibility in decolonizing scholarly knowledge production, and what does that even mean? How's that operationalized in our varying educational contexts? And finally, you know, am I listening? Which, again, is probably what those who are in privileged positions like myself should be doing more, listening rather than lecturing. Por lo tanto, concluiré una vez más con esta nota en la que invito a colaborar en una intervención del LRPP a cualquier persona interesada. Puedo obtener financiación para financiar mi participación, por ejemplo. Y ahora responderé a las preguntas en el idioma que prefieren, pero probablemente responderé en inglés, for obvious reasons.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Corcoran, for this interesting presentation. So we have room for questions, preguntas, cualquier lengua que prefiera. Sí, okay.
James, when you were talking about creating this writing community, like a reading community, I always wonder how difficult it is to teach these courses, the time that you have to spend. But I have not heard about a writing community within the university. Do you have any examples of success, or how can we actually go there? Because it's very time consuming to try to work with a small group of students, and the impact, I think, could be bigger if we have like a writing community. I think that's the ideal that I've been thinking we should aim for. Do you have any, you have been delivering a lot of courses and workshops. Do you have any ideas on how to actually make this possible?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the perfect recipe, but for example, when running these courses, it's making explicit the implicit it's taking time and allowing scholars, these courses, ideally, they're delivered in a discipline-specific manner, right? To a group of, in a sort of broad area, physics, right? And it's encouraging folks who have similar interests to get together. It is creating those small groups within the course and setting aside course time for these groups to get together, describe their work, potentially make plans to form an accountability group. I mean, I do this with my own grad students, right? With my PhD students, is form these groups. And part of what I do, it's, I don't like the term, but the shut up and write part of it. So it starts with some suggestions for research writing, and then there's actual writing, right? And so it's setting aside dedicated time, right? And that's the biggest thing. I mean, I don't know about all of you, but unless I set aside, for example, this semester I have Thursdays and Fridays for my research writing, Thursday and Friday afternoons. If I don't do that, I won't do the writing, right? So setting aside dedicated time, and in this case, when we're talking about writing groups, time for those writing groups in the course, and then hoping that when you provide the conditions for that, that you don't necessarily have to be there beyond that course. I hope that answers a little bit of that.
Yeah, thank you, James.
But I will say, my colleague, who some of you may know in Argentina, Laura Colombo, does some great work on writing groups and has done a lot of research about the potential impact of those groups on scholarly writing.
Thank you very much. We have room for more questions. If I may, I think these are really interesting provocations, very provoking courses of action that we should be working towards, right? What is the dimension of privilege that is involved in being able to write in the language that you want? There may be cases where you are simply enforced by your institution to publish in a specific language in certain journals so that your career has a future, right? So is there any risk in choosing to go the other way? And is the risk worth pursuing? What are the safeguards in case some people decide to take on that risk?
Yeah, it's interesting because there has to be an ethics there, right? So if you're promoting this plurilingual production, at what cost, right, to the scholars that we're working with? And I take that into consideration, right? And there are costs potentially, but the idea is to convince researchers, or at least provide the conditions for them to connect with the communities they want to connect with. And oftentimes those communities are missed when they're publishing in, the highest ranked journal. They're going to connect with other experts in their fields, but if they're, for example, they're doing research on a particular microbe in a lake in central Mexico, and they publish their work in, the best international biology journal, then is that going to connect with the community where they're trying to solve those problems, where the implications of their work can be applied? Not necessarily. So what are they doing to connect with that community, right? And sort of broadening the understanding of what is that knowledge production. So if it's not a research article, maybe it's something more accessible to the population through a one-page blog post, or an article in English for that journal that's going to get them the most points with their science council and with their institution, and then another article in a journal in Spanish, for example. What are the costs? The costs can be there, but I would argue that the benefits could outweigh the costs. And again, I think some of the research is showing that this shift in terms of policies is impacting this production, right? Shifts in policies that are more open to plurilingual knowledge production. What does that look like? Well, the journal connected to this association publishes in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. That's an example. Open access, multilingual. There are multiple entry points, right, to try to challenge these systemic unequal relations of power, right? So there are entry points with gatekeepers at journals, right? So, by the way, if you're not on editorial boards, get on editorial boards. If you're, the journal policies can impact this production. So, it's one thing to do it at the classroom level. It's perhaps more impactful to do it when impacting policy. But again, sometimes, and I can't just talk the talk, right? You have to walk the walk. And that's what I'm trying to model in my work.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Yes. Quiero que te quede más cerca de ti. Gracias.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, you mentioned that, that the pace of scholarship in other languages outside of English has increased. Does that also translate to higher impact, or is it still the case that journals that aren't open access or, the bigger journals like that are still the ones that have the most impact?
Yeah, it depends how you define impact, right? But if we define impact by citations, and by the way, one of the things that I promote during these courses is include citations in local, regional, national languages. That's having a massive impact, right? So including citations in Spanish and Portuguese, even if the work is in English, the article's in English. What is the impact? The impact, if it's, oh, shit, I lost my train of thought. Tell me again the question. Right. So I think, it depends how you define impact, right? If it's by citations, open access articles are increasingly cited more than closed access ones for obvious reasons. However, there are these ideologies that inform our practices around like what's meaningful research production. Many scholars are vain and interested in, the reach of their work in recognition by international communities. Whenever there's work that asks scholars like, why are you publishing in English, for example? The number one answer is, this is how it's done in my discipline. The number two answer is, I want to connect and get recognition from the international community, right? And thus, I'm publishing in this high prestige journal. It doesn't necessarily mean it will get the most clicks, though, and the most citations. So increasingly, there's research that suggests that these open access journal articles, for example, are cited more frequently.
Okay, thank you very much. Any further questions? Well, I'm going to abuse the right of holding the mic. Oh, you have one question. Well, I have one later. So.
I was wondering, can you hear me? I was wondering, when you were talking about the course for the students, whether it's 3 days or 3 weeks, you need to follow certain principles. What language are these principles for? Because there are different writing styles. So when you are talking about English, Portuguese, or Spanish, I suppose there are different writing styles and you have different ideas about these principles.
Yeah, so there are stylistic differences, there are structural differences at times, but I would argue that research writing is research writing. And when promoting the plurilingual production, a compare and contrast approach, right, which highlights some of the similarities and some of the differences, is generally effective in helping students, whether they're emerging scholars or established scholars, determine, what's effective writing in each language.
Yeah, but that would mean that you need to provide different principles there, because maybe Spanish, Portuguese, and English have similar principles for effective writing, but there are languages that have a completely different idea for writing, for effective writing. So can we think of plurilingualism, whatever, for Slavic languages versus English language?
Yeah, it's a good question. Never having given a course in Eastern Europe, for example, because, so I don't know, is
Okay.
the answer.
No, I mean, are these instructions in English or for English?
Yeah. So the course is delivered, and again, there's always this give and take between attending to the wants and the needs of the student population, and yet trying to push this sort of plurilingual approach, right, that promotes this plurality and diversity of knowledge production. Oftentimes the desire is for the course to be delivered in English only, right? And one of the ways that I deal with that is right from the get-go, suggesting here's how this course is going to be delivered. It's going to be delivered plurilingually. It ends up that it's mostly in English, but there are small parts that are delivered in local and national or regional language. So the question of access is important though, right? So generally with these courses, if the students don't have a B2, and again, using Common European Framework for language proficiency, if there's not a B2 level of language proficiency, it can't be effectively taught in that language. So I've seen it done for example, at a particular university in Mexico, I've seen these courses delivered only in Spanish in a discipline where the expectation is publishing in English. You know what I mean? Because that's dealing with the access issue, right? And I would say that's still a reasonable approach and can still be an effective approach and equitable, clearly, or more equitable. Because if not, we're just rewarding those scholars who have had more private language English education as they've gone through their scholarly trajectories. And yeah, so I hope that answers somewhat.
Yeah, it was just interesting for me because I have had experience with C1 or C2 speakers of English, but still, if they were to write an article in English, they would stick to the Slovak way of thinking because I'm from Slovakia, and the text was chaotic, and there was no organization. There were different areas because the Slovak writing is about different things. So even though speaking perfect English, their paper was something that wouldn't be published.
Yeah, and that shows like language proficiency, sort of oral language proficiency, does not guarantee, publishable piece, right? But for example, if I were teaching that course to Slovak speakers in the class, I would have someone who understood the similarities and differences between Slovak and English language research and what that looks like in terms of a research article.
That's what I meant, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking a sort of intercultural rhetorical approach like that, or highlighting structural and rhetorical similarities and differences, I think can be very effective. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to abuse my right of holding the microphone to ask one question. Please don't
Abuse
hit me.
away.
I'd just like to draw an interesting parallel between some of what Dr. Zabala was saying in her talk this morning and what you're presenting here when you show us articles written in indigenous languages. how do you think articles or the use of indigenous language for this particular genre sort of navigates the complex tensions that exist between the registers, the community registers, and the possible difference of I don't know whether to call it status or the expectation that writing the article in the indigenous language is creating a register of prestige in that language. How do you think that those tensions could be navigated?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, in the end, it really doesn't matter what I think. And that's where attending to sort of subjectivities of students, right? So I have students in my institution who want to write their thesis in an indigenous language. They have to fight for that right. And that's the case in most universities in Canada. I would say that's a first step, right? In terms of policy, trying to impact that type of policy. How does it affect the register? It's a good question, right? Again, as someone who's not an Indigenous scholar, but who has worked with Indigenous scholars who are arguing that they want to be able to produce their academic work in that language and to have that space and that right, then I think it should be there.
Muchas gracias. Quería hacer un comentario sobre lo que implica ese panorama de las publicaciones para las investigadoras e investigadores en Latinoamérica. Y yo creo que debe incluir unos principios éticos y epistemológicos diferentes, porque cuando se habla de publicar, de publish or perish, está pensado en la lógica de la competitividad, que es individual, que está pensando en la eficiencia, etcétera. Y nosotros entramos en esa competencia en unas condiciones muy desiguales. Y no podemos entre nosotros mismos actuar bajo esa lógica porque es suicida. Entonces, pienso yo que también revertir esas lógicas es también pensar cómo trabajamos en colaboración, cómo trabajamos con colegas, digamos, en Latinoamérica, cómo publicamos en diferentes idiomas. Hay personas que lo pueden hacer porque ya están en un punto de su carrera que pueden arriesgar más. Otras personas no lo pueden hacer porque están empezando. Entonces, ahí yo creo que también es tener una mirada mucho más solidaria de lo que implica hacer una carrera académica, publicar, etcétera. Y quería mencionar también el ejemplo de la revista latinoamericana de estudios de la escritura. Es una revista que es open access, que publica en tres lenguas, pero tener una revista es costoso. Esa revista existe gracias a que alguien, cuando se retira, deja un fondo que financia la revista. Y el trabajo de las colegas chilenas en Brasil, acá en Colombia, bueno, mucha gente poniendo trabajo también para que pueda ser una revista plurilingüe, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, también implica como unas decisiones conscientes cuando se pueden hacer. Y también entender cuando no se pueden hacer por diferentes razones. Pero sí pienso que desde otra lógica, porque desde la lógica del norte, pues ya entramos en una competencia muy desigual.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even thinking of this market of knowledge production, right, and taking that as understanding, right? So it's advanced capitalist understanding of the value of producing knowledge, and I think those are things that can be challenged in this type of course, right? It's challenging the fast publishing ethic. But oftentimes, again, for students and for faculty, it's not what they're looking for oftentimes. So I have to fight to sort of introduce that logic, right? To challenge those assumptions, to challenge those ideologies. And again, ideally, it's done by local scholars for scholars, you know, who understand the landscape, who understand the pressures, who understand the costs and benefits of publishing their work in these different languages. But I think there is room in those courses to challenge those type of ideologies and understand the immense pressure on those who are supporting the journal that you're describing, right? So one of the big reasons that journals often don't publish in multiple languages is they complain that the human resources, the demand on human resources is too great, right? It's hard enough for us to find reviewers in English for this piece, let alone find multiple reviewers in Spanish or Portuguese, right? And that's why, you know, I applaud even more a journal like that for the work that's put in. And the work is forefronted, right? Like the majority of that work happens in building it up, right? In the first, 5 to 10 years. And then it can smoothly operate. But yeah, without funding, it would be a big challenge. So yes, thanks for your comment.
Bueno, muchas gracias al doctor Corcoran. Pido un nuevo aplauso para él por su estimulante presentación. Bueno, con esto damos cierre al primer día de congreso y quisiera invitarles mañana a las 9:30 a la conferencia magistral con la profesora Judith Kalman a las 9:30. Luego vamos a tener la presentación del estudio de Redless a cargo de la profesora Lina Trigos. Esto va a ser de 11:30 a 2:30. También de 1:30 a 2:30 vamos a tener la presentación de libros. Hay varios libros que se van a presentar, entonces va a estar muy interesante. Tenemos presentaciones concurrentes de 2:30 hasta las 5:30. Un dato muy importante, la asamblea de Redless y la asamblea de ALES son abiertas a todos los miembros de la red. Hay una pequeña inconsistencia en el programa que dice que es solo para los directivos. Realmente es para todos los miembros de la red. Y bueno, al final vamos a terminar con el cóctel de recepción en el restaurante Bocas de Ceniza. Entonces, les esperamos mañana y muchas gracias por su participación el día de hoy.
Explora más contenidos de tu interés. No olvides suscribirte a nuestro canal.